Good evening, and welcome to California Confidential Files. We believe that the most terrifying stories are not the ones that happen in faraway, haunted places, but the ones that unfold right next door, behind the familiar facades of our own communities. They're the stories that remind us that the greatest evil can hide behind the most welcoming smile. Tonight, we journey to the historic, tight-knit neighborhood of Havenwood in Boston, a place that, on the surface, was a perfect picture of American charm and tradition. At the very heart of this community was Rose Fitzgerald, better known to everyone as Grandma Rose. She was the neighborhood's matriarch, its keeper of traditions, and the baker of the most famous apple pie in the entire state of Massachusetts. Her pie was more than a dessert. It was a symbol of everything good and pure about Havenwood. But it held a secret so vile, so unthinkable, it would eventually tear the community apart and sicken the soul of a nation. This is the story of Grandma Rose's famous apple pie and the horrifying truth about its one secret ingredient. So, if you're not afraid to peel back the crust and see the darkness underneath, then you're in the right place. And if you believe these stories need to be told, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You must see this story through to its horrifying conclusion. Now, let's go back to a crisp October day, to a neighborhood street fair where a terrible secret was being served by the slice. The Havenwood Harvest Fair was the jewel in the crown of the neighborhood's social calendar. It was a perfect, Rockwellian scene painted in the vibrant hues of a New England autumn. The crisp air smelled of mulled cider, roasting nuts, and the sweet, cinnamon-laced perfume of Grandma Rose's apple pies. Her stall, positioned in the prime spot at the center of the square, was the fair's undisputed main attraction. A line of eager residents, a mix of old-money Brahmins and young families who'd paid a fortune for a piece of this historic charm, snaked around the block. At the center of it all was Rose Fitzgerald herself. A woman in her late 70s, she was small and bird-like, with a cloud of snow-white hair and eyes as blue and kind as a summer sky. Her hands, though gnarled with arthritis, moved with a practiced, loving efficiency as she sliced her magnificent creations. Her pies were legendary. The crust was impossibly flaky, the apple filling perfectly spiced. But there was something else, a secret, savory depth to the flavor that no one could ever quite replicate or identify. It was rich, almost meaty. People joked it was her magic touch. Detective Marcus Thorne hated fairs. He was a transplant from the gritty, no-nonsense streets of South Boston, and the self-satisfied, insulated charm of Havenwood grated on him. He was only here because his captain, a political animal, insisted his detectives build community trust. For Thorne, that meant making a token appearance, smiling awkwardly, and buying a slice of the pie everyone seemed to worship as if it were a holy relic. He stood in line, feeling out of place in his leather jacket amidst the cashmere sweaters and tweed blazers. When he finally reached the front, Grandma Rose beamed at him. "Detective Thorne," she chirped, her voice like wind chimes. "So good of you to join us. A slice of my apple, I presume? It's a special batch today. Made with love." "Yes, ma'am," he said, handing her a $10 bill. The pie was, he had to admit, ridiculously good. He ate it as he did a slow lap of the fair, a duty-bound patrol of this alien territory. It was during this lap that the first, almost invisible thread of a darker story was woven into the day's cheerful tapestry. He saw Mrs. O'Malley, the neighborhood's chief gossip, talking in a hushed, frantic tone to another resident. Thorne, a man trained to read lips and body language, slowed his pace. He caught a few key phrases, "That awful Gallo boy," and "Haven't seen him in a week," and a final, dismissive, "Good riddance." The Gallo boy was Ricky Slim Gallo. Thorne knew the name well. Gallo was a 28-year-old low-level drug dealer and petty thief, a festering sore on the pristine face of Havenwood. He preyed on the neighborhood's bored, wealthy teenagers, selling them pills and pot. He was a constant nuisance, but he was slippery, never holding enough to warrant a major charge. He was, in short, a problem that everyone wished would just go away. And now, apparently, he had. Thorne made a mental note. A missing person report hadn't been filed, but it was worth keeping an ear out for. He finished his pie, tossed the plate, and decided he had fulfilled his community trust-building duties for the day. He was heading back to his car when a small commotion near the children's face-painting booth caught his attention. It was the Henderson family. The father, a high-strung lawyer named Paul, was kneeling in front of his 8-year-old son, Timmy. The boy was crying. The mother, Sarah, was trying to placate him, her face pale with a strange, panicked urgency. "It was yucky, Mommy," Timmy wailed, pointing at a half-eaten slice of apple pie on the ground. "There was something in it." "Timmy, honey, it was just a piece of apple core. That's all," Sarah said, her voice a little too high, a little too fast. "Let's go get you some ice cream." "No," the boy insisted, his voice rising. "It wasn't a core. It was chewy, and it had blue on it." Paul Henderson shot a nervous glance around, saw Thorne watching, and immediately tried to shut the situation down. "He's just tired, officer," Paul said, forcing a tight, unnatural smile. "Ate too much sugar. You know how it is." He scooped the boy up, and the family made a hasty retreat, leaving the half-eaten slice of pie on the grass. Thorne stood there, a strange, cold feeling prickling the back of his neck. It was nothing. A tired kid, an overreacting parent. But the father's panic had seemed disproportionate, and the boy's insistence on the color blue was oddly specific. He walked over to the discarded paper plate. The pie was a messy heap of apples and crust. He nudged it with the toe of his boot, and he saw it. Tucked within the gooey apple filling was a small, grayish, rubbery-looking piece of something. It was about the size of a postage stamp. It wasn't an apple core, and on its surface was a small, unmistakable patch of faded, dark blue ink. It looked like a piece of a tattoo. The world seemed to slow down. The cheerful sounds of the fair, the music, the laughter faded into a distant, muffled hum. Thorne knelt, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He pulled a pen from his pocket and used it to carefully lift the object. It was pliable with a distinct texture on one side, the texture of skin. He thought of the hushed conversation he'd overheard. "That awful Gallo boy, haven't seen him in a week." He thought of the file photo he had seen of Ricky Gallo just last month, after a minor arrest. The photo had shown Gallo's distinctive tattoos, a litany of badly inked skulls and daggers, and on his left forearm, a small, crudely drawn spider, inked in faded blue. Thorne stood up, the horrifying object still balanced on the end of his pen. He looked over at Grandma Rose's stall. The line was still there, full of happy, smiling families, all eagerly waiting to buy a slice of her famous pie. A pie made, he now suspected with a dawning, sickening certainty, with more than just love. He looked at the piece of skin. Then he looked at the crowd. A wave of nausea, so profound it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. The secret ingredient wasn't a rare spice. It wasn't a family recipe. It was a person the whole neighborhood had wished would just disappear. And somehow, in the most grotesque, unimaginable way, it seemed Grandma Rose had granted their wish. He pulled out his phone, his hand trembling slightly. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a homicide, and the entire neighborhood was a crime scene. The immediate aftermath of Detective Thorne's discovery was a study in controlled chaos. He made the call, and within minutes, the cheerful symphony of the Havenwood Harvest Fair was silenced by the discordant wail of sirens. Thorne acted with a cold, swift efficiency that seemed alien in this world of relaxed gentility. He secured the small piece of tattooed skin in an evidence bag, a grotesque and surreal object that felt like a fragment from a nightmare. He instructed a uniformed officer to discreetly but firmly shut down Grandma Rose's stall, confiscating every remaining pie, every utensil, every jar as evidence. The reaction from the crowd was a wave of indignant confusion. People who, moments before, had been praising the pie now looked on in horror as their beloved neighborhood matriarch stall was dismantled by police. Grandma Rose herself seemed to shrink, her kind, blue eyes filling with a bewildered hurt. She didn't protest. She simply stood, a frail, confused old woman, as the officers worked around her. "Marcus, what on earth is the meaning of this?" His captain, a political animal named Walsh, hissed into the phone when Thorne briefed him. "You're shutting down the centerpiece of the harvest fair based on a kid's tantrum and a piece of what? You'd better be damn sure about this." "I'm sure," Thorne said, his voice flat. His eyes locked on the evidence bag in his hand. The Henderson family was intercepted before they could leave the fair. They were escorted to a quiet corner of the square. Their initial panic now hardened into a defensive, upper-class outrage. "This is harassment," Paul Henderson blustered, his lawyerly instincts kicking in. "My son is 8 years old. He has an overactive imagination. You can't possibly be taking this seriously. Your son said there was something in his pie, Mr. Henderson," Thorne said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "I found this." He held up the evidence bag. Sarah Henderson let out a small, strangled gasp and turned away. Paul's face went white. The bluster vanished, replaced by a raw, naked fear. "We don't know anything," he stammered. We saw it. We panicked. We didn't want to make a scene." "A scene," Thorne repeated, his voice incredulous. "You found what looks like a piece of a human being in your son's dessert, and your primary concern was not making a scene?" The Hendersons were taken to the station for a formal statement, their departure leaving a toxic cloud of rumor and speculation hanging over the ruined fair. The piece, a dozen of them, magnificent golden brown works of art, were transported to the crime lab like fragile, edible bombs. The next 24 hours were a blur of high-priority lab work. The piece of skin was rushed for DNA analysis. The tattoo was cross-referenced with the police database. By the next morning, Thorne had his confirmation. The tattoo was a positive match for one registered to Ricardo Slim Gallo. The preliminary DNA results from the skin fragment were a match to a sample from Gallo's last arrest. The missing person that no one had reported was now the city's newest homicide victim. The real bombshell came from the analysis of the pies themselves. The lab technicians worked through the night, meticulously dissecting each slice. Their report was clinical, scientific, and utterly horrifying. Mixed in with the apples and the cinnamon, they found trace amounts of rendered human fat used in the crust. And the savory, meaty richness that had made the pies so famous? It came from small, finely minced, and slow-cooked pieces of human muscle tissue, consistent with flesh from the upper thigh and shoulder. The lab identified DNA from a single male source throughout all the pies, Ricardo Gallo. Grandma Rose's famous apple pie was, quite literally, made of him. Armed with this nauseating proof, Thorne and his team descended on the charming, ivy-covered row house that Rose Fitzgerald shared with her middle-aged son, Michael. Michael was a quiet, bookish man who worked as a rare book librarian at the Boston Athenaeum, a gentle soul who seemed to exist in a different, more refined century. He met them at the door, his face a mask of confusion and worry. "Detectives," he said, wringing his hands. "I don't understand. My mother, she's been at my aunt's house all morning. She's terribly distraught. What is this all about?" "We have a warrant to search the premises, Mr. Fitzgerald," Thorne said, handing him the document. The house was a time capsule. It was filled with antique furniture, polished silver, and the faint, sweet scent of cinnamon and dried lavender. It was a house that radiated a sense of history, of quiet, respectable lives lived within its walls. But Thorne knew that behind that facade lay a charnel house. The kitchen was the first stop. It was a large, old-fashioned space, with a massive cast-iron stove and well-worn butcher block countertops. It was immaculately clean, too clean. The forensics team began their work, swabbing every surface, looking for the invisible traces of a gruesome crime. Thorne's attention was drawn to the pantry. It was a deep walk-in closet, lined with shelves that were filled with hundreds of jars of preserved fruits, vegetables, and, of course, jams. It was a testament to a lifetime of canning. But on the floor, in the back corner, was a large, chest-style deep freezer. "We need this opened, Michael," Thorne said. Michael's face paled. It's just for storage. My mother keeps her extra pie crusts in there. And some meat from the butcher." One of the officers opened the heavy lid. The freezer was packed with neatly wrapped white butcher paper parcels, all labeled in Rose's elegant, looping handwriting. "Pork roast," one read. "Beef shank," said another. But at the bottom there were other parcels, larger ones, wrapped in the same neat paper, but labeled differently. One was labeled simply, "Special Roast for Pies." A forensics tech, her face grim, carefully lifted one of the special parcels. It was frozen solid and unnaturally heavy. She began to unwrap it on a sterile sheet on the kitchen floor. As the paper came away, the room fell silent. It was a human hand and forearm, severed cleanly at the elbow. On the forearm was the faint, bluish ink of a crudely drawn spider tattoo. Michael Fitzgerald let out a sound that was not quite a word, not quite a scream, and fainted dead away, collapsing in a heap on his own immaculate kitchen floor. While the medics attended to Michael, Thorne continued the search. The real heart of the operation wasn't in the kitchen. It was in the basement. The basement was a stark contrast to the elegant home above. It was a damp, stone-walled cellar, the kind of place that had existed since the house was built in the 19th century. And it had been converted into a gruesome workshop. In the center of the room was a huge, antique cast-iron cauldron, big enough to boil a side of beef, set over a powerful, modern propane burner. The floor around it was stained dark, and the air, despite a recent, frantic scrubbing with bleach, held a thick, coppery, sweet smell. Against one wall was a butcher's table, its wooden surface scarred with a million knife cuts. On the wall above it, hanging from hooks, were not kitchen utensils, but a set of tools that belonged in a butcher shop or a morgue. Cleavers, boning knives, and a hacksaw. They were all spotlessly clean, but the forensics team knew what they would find. Thorne stood in the center of the cellar, the full, horrifying picture of Rose Fitzgerald's operation laid bare. This was her factory. This was where she had transformed a neighborhood nuisance into a celebrated delicacy. He thought of her, small, frail, with her kind eyes and gentle smile, and tried to reconcile that image with the brutal, methodical butcher who had worked in this room. The two images refused to merge. It was like trying to imagine a songbird gutting a deer. He went back upstairs. The house was now swarming with crime scene technicians. Michael had been revived and was sitting in a state of catatonic shock on a parlor chair, wrapped in a blanket. Thorne still had one crucial question. He knelt in front of Michael, his voice gentle. "Michael," he said, "the man we found, Ricky Gallo. Did you know him?" Michael stared at him, his eyes vacant. He seemed to be looking through Thorne at a memory. He began to speak, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "He was a monster," Michael whispered. "He hurt people. He hurt a girl. A young girl in the neighborhood. The O'Malley's granddaughter. He got her hooked on things. He ruined her. But the police, you couldn't do anything. There was no proof." Michael's gaze finally focused on Thorne, and his eyes filled with a strange, lucid fire. "My mother," he said, his voice gaining a chilling strength, "is a great believer in justice, detective, and in a garden, when you find a weed that is choking the life out of your flowers, you don't just complain about it. You pull it out by the root." Thorne stood up, a cold realization dawning. Rose Fitzgerald wasn't a random, ghoulish serial killer. She was something far more complex and perhaps far more terrifying. She was a vigilante, a protector, a neighborhood gardener who had decided to do her own horrifying and ultimately unspeakable weeding. The arrest of Rose Fitzgerald was conducted with a quiet solemnity that felt profoundly out of place. Thorne found her not hiding, not fleeing, but sitting in her sister's sun-drenched garden in a neighboring town, calmly sipping tea. When she saw him, she simply placed her teacup in its saucer, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. There was no surprise in her eyes, only a deep, weary resignation. as if she were a character in a Greek tragedy who had long known this final act was inevitable. The interrogation was not a battle of wills. It was a story told by a woman who believed her actions were not just justified, but righteous. She waived her right to an attorney, dismissing the idea with a small, bird-like wave of her hand. "Lawyers are for people who have something to hide, detective," she said, her voice soft but imbued with an unshakable moral certainty. "My actions are a matter of public record. Or I suppose they are now." She sat in the stark, gray interrogation room, a splash of old-world grace in a world of harsh, modern angles. She began her story not with the murder, but with the neighborhood, with Havenwood. "You are not from here, Detective Thorne," she began, her tone not accusatory, but explanatory. "So you cannot possibly understand. Havenwood is not just a collection of houses. It is a garden, a place my family and others have tended for generations. We cultivated it, protected it from blight." In her telling, Ricardo Slim Gallo was not a person. He was a blight, a poisonous, invasive weed that had taken root in their perfect garden. She recounted, with a chilling, dispassionate clarity, a litany of his transgressions, not just the petty drug dealing, but the acts of cruelty and predation that never made it into a police report. She spoke of him swindling an elderly resident out of her pension money, of his cruel torment of a mentally disabled man who lived on the block, and finally of what he had done to the O'Malley's granddaughter, a bright, promising 16-year-old girl named Jenny. "He was a rot," she said, her blue eyes turning as hard and cold as chips of ice. "He was poisoning the soil. He got that sweet girl addicted to his filth, took her innocence, and left her an empty shell. Her family was destroyed. And you, detective, with all your laws and procedures, you were powerless. You trimmed the branches, but you refused to pull the root." Her decision, in her mind, was not one of rage, but of necessity. It was an act of civic duty, the final, unpleasant task of a dedicated gardener. The motive was not personal gain or vengeance. It was communal purification. The murder itself, she explained, was almost an afterthought, a simple, practical matter. She knew Gallo's habits. She knew he was greedy and arrogant. She had her son, Michael, who she described as a good boy, but constitutionally weak, leave an anonymous tip for Gallo about a score, a collection of rare, valuable stamps supposedly sitting in an empty house. She knew Gallo couldn't resist the bait. She had waited for him in the empty house, a property that had been in her family for years and was sitting vacant between renters. She didn't use a gun or a knife. Those were loud, messy tools. She used what she knew. She had offered him a drink, a flask of expensive whiskey, to celebrate his good fortune. The whiskey was laced with a massive, concentrated dose of oleander extract, a poison she had patiently brewed herself from the bushes in her own perfect garden. It was potent, fast-acting, and, as she noted with a hint of pride, entirely organic. "He felt no pain," she stated, as if this were a point of great moral importance. "He simply went to sleep." The truly horrifying part of her confession was her explanation for what came next. It was here that Thorne saw the true, terrifying nature of her pathology. There was no panic, no ghoulish excitement. There was only a cold, waste-not, want-not pragmatism that was born of a Depression-era mindset. "A body is a problem, detective," she explained, as if lecturing a student on the principles of home economics. "It is large, it is cumbersome, and it is, frankly, a terrible waste. To bury it is to risk discovery. To sink it in the harbor is unreliable. I am a woman who believes in using all parts of the animal. It is a sign of respect for the harvest." Thorne felt a wave of nausea. "You considered him a harvest?" "In a manner of speaking," she replied, unfazed. "He was a pest that needed to be removed from the garden. But even a pest has its uses. Can be turned into fertilizer, can it not? It can be used to nourish the very thing it sought to destroy." This was her logic. Twisted, insane, but in her mind, perfectly circular and just. She had taken the poison out of her community, and she had transformed it into nourishment. She described the process in her basement with the detached air of a master chef discussing her craft. The butchering, the rendering, the slow cooking in the cauldron. She spoke of how she had discovered that the unique chemical composition of human fat, when rendered and clarified, created a pie crust of unparalleled flakiness. She explained how the slow-cooked meat, when minced and blended with the tartness of the apples and the warmth of the cinnamon, created a savory, umami-like depth that was impossible to achieve with animal protein alone. She had turned her act of vigilante justice into a culinary masterpiece. And the final, most grotesque turn of the screw was the act of serving it to the community. Did they not all wish him gone? She asked, a genuine question in her eyes. Did you not hear them whisper at the fair? Good riddance, they said. They were all complicit in the desire, detective. I simply provided the service. And when they ate my pie, they were, in their own way, participating in the cleansing. They were taking the rot into themselves and transforming it into a celebration. It was a sacrament, a final, communal act of purification. Thorne stared at her, speechless. She was not a monster in the way he understood monsters. She was not driven by rage or bloodlust. She was driven by a profoundly warped sense of love and a perverted, absolute moral clarity. She was the matriarch of her tribe, and she had made a human sacrifice to protect it, then fed the remains to her people as a holy communion. The investigation now had to turn outward. Rose Fitzgerald was the killer, but her confession implicated the entire neighborhood. Were they just complicit in their desires, as she claimed? Or was the rot in Havenwood deeper than just one old woman and her cauldron? Thorne now had to investigate the very people he had seen lining up for that pie, the people whose children he had watched playing at the fair. He had to determine if they were simply victims of a grotesque deception, or if they were, in some quiet, unspoken way, willing participants in Grandma Rose's horrifying harvest. Rose Fitzgerald's confession was a legal endgame but an investigative beginning. She had admitted to the act, but her chilling, quasi-religious justification had implicated the entire neighborhood. Her claim that the community was complicit in the desire for Ricky Gallo's removal could be dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind, but for Detective Thorne, it posed a professional and moral challenge. He had a killer in custody, but he now had to investigate a motive that was rooted not in a single twisted mind, but in the collective soul of a community. Was Havenwood a garden of innocent flowers tended by a single murderous gardener? Or was it a poisoned orchard, where every tree had been nourished by a silent, shared toxicity? The investigation turned from forensics to psychology. Thorne and his team began the slow, deeply uncomfortable process of re-interviewing the residents of Havenwood, not as witnesses to a disappearance, but as potential character witnesses in a trial about the very nature of their community. The first interviews were with the O'Malley family. Their granddaughter, Jenny, the bright 16-year-old whose life had been derailed by her involvement with Gallo, was now in a residential treatment facility. Her parents were broken, haunted by guilt and anger. "Did we wish him gone, Mr. O'Malley said, his voice a low, ragged whisper as he sat in his perfectly appointed living room. Every single day, I'd see him on the street, swaggering around like he owned the place, and I would feel a kind of hate I didn't know I was capable of. I would fantasize about him just disappearing." He looked at Thorne, his eyes filled with a wretched self-loathing. "Does that make me a monster, detective? Does that make me complicit in what she did?" It was a question Thorne would hear in various forms a dozen times over the next week. The residents of Havenwood were trapped in a moral quagmire. They were horrified and nauseated by Rose's actions, but they couldn't deny the profound sense of relief that Gallo's disappearance had brought. They had all, in their own quiet ways, benefited from the crime. Thorne then focused on Michael Fitzgerald, Rose's quiet, bookish son. Michael had been released from the hospital and was now staying with his aunt, a shell of a man haunted by a truth he could no longer ignore. In his second interview, away from the initial shock, a more detailed and damning picture emerged. "Did I know what she was capable of?" Michael said, staring into a cold cup of tea. "No. Not this. But did I know she was handling the Gallo problem? In a way, yes. He admitted that his mother had spoken to him for weeks about the blight of Ricky Gallo. She had been methodical, gathering information, detailing his every transgression. Michael had assumed she was building a case to bring to the police, or perhaps to organize a community pressure campaign. She asked me for the key to the vacant house. Michael confessed, his voice barely audible. She said she wanted to air it out before the new tenants arrived. I didn't question it. He also admitted to leaving the anonymous tip for Gallo at his mother's direction. She said she was going to frighten him off, Michael explained, his words a desperate attempt to rationalize his own role. She said she was going to confront him, offer him money to leave town, and use some information she'd gathered to scare him into accepting. I thought she was just going to be the strong one, the one who finally stood up to him. I never imagined. His voice trailed off. He was a weak man, and his mother had leveraged that weakness with surgical precision. He wasn't a co-conspirator in a murder, but he had been the unwitting accomplice who had led the lamb to the slaughter. The most disturbing interviews, however, were with the core members of Rose's social circle, the matriarchs of Havenwood who had been her friends for over 50 years. They were a wall of carefully worded deflections and fierce, protective loyalty. Rose was a pillar of this community. One of them, a woman named Beatrice, stated firmly, she was a woman of strong moral character. That Gallo boy was a menace. If the police were unable or unwilling to protect us, then one cannot be surprised when the community decides to protect itself. Thorne pressed them. Are you saying you condone what she did? Of course not, Detective. Beatrice sniffed, her expression indignant. It was a terrible, tragic thing. Rose clearly had a breakdown. She was under immense stress, watching what that creature was doing to the O'Malley girl. Her mind must have just snapped. They were closing ranks. They were creating a new narrative, a story that transformed their friend from a cold, calculating vigilante into a tragic, mentally unstable figure who had cracked under the strain of her own empathy. It was a more palatable version of the truth, one that absolved Rose of her monstrous clarity and, by extension, absolved them of their shared, silent approval of the outcome. The final piece of this communal puzzle came from an unexpected source. The Henderson family, the ones whose son had found the piece of skin in the pie, had been ostracized. Their panic, their decision to involve the police, was seen by some of the neighborhood's old guard as a betrayal. Paul Henderson, his law practice suffering and his family being shunned, came to see Thorne, his anger now directed at the community that had turned on him. You want to know about secrets, Detective? He said, his voice tight with fury. Let me tell you about the Havenwood Garden Club. He explained that the Garden Club was a euphemism for the neighborhood's inner circle of power brokers, run by Rose and her friends. They were the unofficial government of Havenwood. They decided who was in and who was out. They used their influence to protect their own, to drive out undesirable businesses, and to maintain the pristine, exclusionary facade of their community. And Henderson revealed they had a slush fund, an off-the-books account funded by anonymous donations at neighborhood events. It was used for things like hiring private security or funding legal challenges to low-income housing projects in neighboring areas. And Paul suspected it was used for more direct interventions. A few years ago, he explained, there was a homeless man who used to sleep in the square, a gentle soul but an eyesore. He made people uncomfortable. One day he was just gone. The story was that the Garden Club had bought him a one-way bus ticket to a city with better social services. Everyone called it an act of charity. He looked at Thorne, his eyes wide. But what if it wasn't? What if it was just them weeding the garden, getting rid of a problem? Thorne now saw the full picture. Rose Fitzgerald was not an anomaly. She was the logical, if extreme, product of her environment. Havenwood was a community so obsessed with its own perfection, so insulated from the messy realities of the world, that it had cultivated a quiet, ruthless system for eliminating anything that threatened its pristine image. They had, for years, outsourced their dirty work to their beloved matriarch. Most of them probably never knew the full extent of her methods, but they had benefited from the results, and they had rewarded her with their loyalty and their silence. The pies, in the end, were her mistake. It was an act of hubris, a grotesque piece of performance art that had finally exposed the rot that had been festering under the surface of the perfect garden for decades. The entire neighborhood was her accomplice, not in the act of murder, but in the creation of the monster who had committed it. The trial of Rose Fitzgerald was not a trial of facts, but of narrative. The prosecution, led by a sharp, ambitious assistant district attorney, presented a straightforward, horrifying case. They had the body parts, the DNA evidence, the forensic analysis of the pies, and a detailed, videotaped confession. They painted a picture of a cold, methodical killer who had committed an act of unspeakable brutality and then, with a level of hubris that was almost satanic, had served the evidence of her crime to her friends and neighbors. The defense, a high-priced team funded by the Havenwood Garden Club's slush fund, did not dispute the facts. They couldn't. Instead, they attempted to build a narrative of their own. They sought to put the community's fear on trial, to put Ricky Gallo's villainy on trial, to put the very failure of the justice system on trial. They portrayed Rose Fitzgerald not as a monster, but as a tragic, folk hero figure, a frail grandmother who had been driven to a desperate act by a broken system and her fierce, protective love for her community. They called her a gardener, just as she had called herself. The trial became a national sensation, a macabre piece of public theater. It was the Cannibal Granny trial. Media outlets from around the world descended on Boston, broadcasting live from the courthouse steps. The story was perfect for the 24-hour news cycle, a grotesque fairy tale of a wolf hiding in grandmother's clothing. Inside the courtroom, the testimony was devastating. The Hendersons recounted their son's horrifying discovery. The O'Malley family tearfully described the ruin of their daughter's life at the hands of Ricky Gallo. One by one, residents of Havenwood took the stand, forced to answer the unanswerable question, "Did you eat the pie?" Their shame and revulsion were palpable. Michael Fitzgerald's testimony was the most heartbreaking. A broken man, he detailed his mother's manipulation and his own willful blindness, his voice a monotone of guilt. He was a man mourning his mother, his victim, and his own moral courage all at once. But the most powerful moment of the trial came when Rose Fitzgerald herself took the stand. Against her lawyer's frantic advice, she insisted. She walked to the witness box with a slow, steady dignity. She was not a ranting lunatic. She was a calm, articulate, and utterly convinced schoolteacher, there to deliver a final, chilling lesson in her personal brand of civic justice. She looked directly at the jury, her blue eyes clear and unwavering, and she told her story. She did not ask for pity. She did not ask for forgiveness. She explained her actions as the logical, necessary solution to a problem that the men with their laws were too cowardly to solve. "That boy was a cancer," she said, her voice filling the silent courtroom. "You do not reason with a cancer. You do not negotiate with it. You cut it out before it can spread. I did what any responsible gardener would do. I protected my garden. My only regret," she concluded, her gaze sweeping over the horrified faces in the gallery, "is that my methods, while effective, were perhaps unpalatable to the modern sensibility." In the end, the jury was out for less than 4 hours. The evidence was too overwhelming, the act too monstrous. They found her guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and desecration of a human body. The judge, his face a mask of stern disgust, sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rose Fitzgerald received her sentence without a flicker of emotion, giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if the verdict were a mere formality, an irrelevant postscript to a job she believed was well done. Owen stands in the same quiet, leafy square in Havenwood where the story began. It is a year later. The season has turned. The trees are bare. The air is cold. The cheerful energy is gone, replaced by a somber, heavy quiet. Rose Fitzgerald will die in prison, Owen says, his voice a low, somber murmur. But the questions her case raised still haunt this neighborhood. Was she a monster, A folk hero? Or was she simply the product of a community so obsessed with its own perfection that it was willing to look the other way while she did its dirty work? He begins to walk, the camera following him. The fallout for Havenwood was immense. The Garden Club was disbanded amidst a flurry of lawsuits and public outrage. House prices plummeted as the neighborhood became a ghoulish tourist attraction for murderinos and true crime fanatics. Families moved away, unable to wash the taint of the story from their lives. The tight-knit community, the very thing Rose claimed to be protecting, was shattered, perhaps irrevocably. He stops in front of her house. It is empty, a for sale sign on the lawn, its windows like dark, vacant eyes. The greatest tragedy is not just the death of a man, however vile he may have been, or the damnation of an old woman. The greatest tragedy is the loss of trust, the poisoning of a community's soul. The residents of Havenwood were forced to confront a horrifying truth, that the sweet, comforting traditions they cherished could be used to conceal an unspeakable evil. They had to accept that they had not just been neighbors to a monster, they had been her customers. Owen looks directly into the camera, his expression conveying the full, chilling weight of the story. In the end, everyone loved Grandma Rose's apple pie. They praised its perfect crust, its savory depth. It was a symbol of home, of tradition, of safety. But it was a lie. It was a symbol of a community that had made a silent, devil's bargain, trading its morality for a false sense of peace. And the secret ingredient, the one they could never quite name, was not just the flesh of their enemy, but the darkness that resides in the heart of any place that values perfection above all else. A darkness that, once tasted, can never be forgotten. The final shot lingers on the empty house, a cold wind rustling the dead leaves on the lawn. It is a monument to a harvest of horrors, a permanent, bitter reminder of the day the whole town was forced to eat its sins.